For centuries, the coastal kingdoms of medieval Europe invested enormous resources in what they believed to be impregnable defenses. Stone fortifications rose along shorelines, watchtowers dotted cliff tops, and armed garrisons stood ready to repel seaborne invaders. Kings and nobles slept soundly, confident that their elaborate systems of walls, beacons, and stationed warriors would provide ample warning and protection against any threat from the sea. Yet between the late 8th and 11th centuries, these supposedly foolproof defenses proved catastrophically inadequate against an enemy who had mastered the art of maritime deception. The Vikings. The Viking Age, traditionally dated from the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE to the Battle of Hastings in 1066, witnessed an unprecedented wave of Scandinavian expansion across Europe. What made these Nordic warriors so devastatingly effective was not merely their ferocity in battle or their superior seamanship, though both played crucial roles. Rather, it was their systematic exploitation of a fundamental flaw in medieval coastal defense strategy, a flaw so profound that it rendered centuries of military architecture and tactical planning virtually obsolete. The coastal defenses of early medieval Europe were designed according to logical principles that had served previous generations reasonably well. The Roman Empire had established a tradition of coastal fortifications, and post-Roman kingdoms maintained and adapted these strategies. The fundamental assumption was straightforward. Enemies arriving by sea would be visible from a considerable distance, allowing defenders time to muster forces, signal neighboring settlements, and prepare for battle. Watchtowers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of vision, ensuring that no vessel could approach undetected. Fortified harbors and river mouths were blocked with chains or stakes, forcing attackers into predictable choke points where defenders held every advantage. These defenses had been conceived with certain expectations about how naval warfare operated. Mediterranean and earlier Northern European maritime conflicts typically involved large fleets of vessels that were readily visible and required significant time to bring ashore. Naval engagements often occurred at sea rather than involving amphibious landings. When landings did occur, they happened at predictable locations, established harbors, river mouths, or beaches with suitable conditions for bringing traditional vessels ashore. This pattern of warfare had shaped defensive thinking for generations. The Vikings, however, fought according to entirely different rules. Their revolutionary ship design, the longship, changed every calculation upon which coastal defenses were based. These vessels, with their shallow draft, symmetrical bow and stern, and combination of sail and oar propulsion, possessed capabilities that defensive planners had never anticipated. A fully laden longship could operate in waters as shallow as 3 feet, allowing Vikings to navigate rivers, estuaries, and coastal shallows that defenders assumed were impassable. The ship's relatively light construction meant they could be portaged overland when necessary, bypassing defensive barriers entirely. But the longship's physical capabilities, remarkable as they were, constituted only one element of the Vikings' deceptive advantage. The true genius of their approach lay in exploiting the cognitive biases and structural limitations of the defenders' systems. Medieval coastal defense relied heavily on visual surveillance, watchtowers scanning the horizon for approaching sails. This system worked adequately in good weather and daylight, but Vikings had no intention of limiting their operations to conditions favorable to defenders. The archaeology of Viking raids reveals a consistent pattern of attacks timed to exploit poor visibility. Fog, common along northern European coasts, became the Vikings' ally. Rather than waiting for clear weather, raiding parties would deliberately approach coastlines during foggy conditions, using their intimate knowledge of celestial navigation and dead reckoning to maintain their course even when visibility dropped to mere meters. By the time watchtowers spotted the distinctive silhouettes of longships, the vessels were often already close enough to shore that defenders had insufficient time to mount an effective response. Night attacks represented another dimension of this tactical deception. While Mediterranean naval traditions generally avoided nighttime operations due to navigation difficulties, Vikings embraced the darkness. Their combination of stellar navigation, knowledge of coastal landmarks, and willingness to accept the risks of night sailing gave them the element of surprise. Watchtower fires, intended to signal approaching threats, instead became navigation beacons that guided raiders toward their targets. Defenders lit their own way for the enemy. The seasonal timing of raids formed yet another layer of deception. Coastal communities anticipated attacks during summer months when weather was favorable and seas were calmer. This expectation was so ingrained that many regions maintained heightened vigilance only during the campaigning season, relaxing their guard as autumn approached. Vikings exploited this pattern by conducting raids during transitional periods, late autumn and early spring, when defenders assumed the sailing season had ended or had not yet begun. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites indicates that some of the most devastating raids occurred in months traditionally considered unsuitable for maritime operations. Geographic deception proved equally crucial. Coastal defenses concentrated on obvious targets: wealthy monasteries near the shore, trading towns, and strategic river mouths. Vikings certainly attacked these locations, but they also demonstrated remarkable skill at identifying and exploiting undefended or lightly defended areas. They would beach their ships at unexpected locations, obscure coves, unremarkable stretches of coastline, or points where defenders assumed the terrain made landing impossible, then travel overland to strike targets from unexpected directions. This approach transformed the strategic calculus of defense. A kingdom might have well-fortified major settlements and carefully watched primary approaches, but Vikings simply circumvented these strong points. They struck at secondary targets, creating a crisis of resource allocation for defenders. Protecting every possible landing site required dispersing forces so thinly that no location had adequate defense. Concentrating forces at key points left vast stretches of coastline vulnerable. The Vikings had created a situation where every defensive strategy contained inherent weaknesses they could exploit. The sophistication of Viking intelligence gathering has only recently been fully appreciated by historians. Far from being simple raiders who appeared randomly out of the sea, Vikings conducted systematic reconnaissance. Trading expeditions that seemed peaceful often doubled as intelligence-gathering missions, with merchants noting defensive arrangements, garrison strengths, and the locations of portable wealth. Some evidence suggests Vikings even employed scouts who would travel inland posing as traders or pilgrims, gathering information about the political situation, feuds between local lords, and the timing of fairs and religious gatherings when wealth concentrated in predictable locations. This intelligence network enabled Vikings to time raids for maximum effect and minimum resistance. They struck during harvest season when warriors were occupied in fields rather than manning defenses. They exploited political instability, attacking regions weakened by succession disputes or civil conflict. Contemporary chronicles record instances where Vikings demonstrated remarkably accurate knowledge of internal affairs, knowledge that could only have come from deliberate intelligence operations. The Vikings' mastery of deception extended far beyond simply arriving undetected. Once their presence became known, they employed sophisticated strategies of misdirection that repeatedly wrong-footed defenders and rendered coordinated resistance nearly impossible. These tactics exploited fundamental weaknesses in medieval communication systems and the psychological tendencies of commanders facing crisis situations. One of the most effective deceptive techniques involved the use of feint attacks. Vikings would dispatch a portion of their fleet to threaten one location, drawing defensive forces to that point, while the main body of raiders struck elsewhere. Contemporary chronicles from Francia, England, and Ireland contain numerous accounts of this pattern. Defenders would receive reports of Viking ships approaching a major monastery or trading center, muster their forces, and march to intercept, only to discover either that the Viking force was much smaller than reported, or that while they had been drawn away, the real attack was occurring dozens of miles distant at an undefended location. The psychological impact of these feints proved as valuable as their immediate tactical benefits. After experiencing several such deceptions, local commanders became hesitant and uncertain. When reports arrived of Viking ships, was this a genuine major attack requiring full mobilization or a feint designed to draw forces out of position? This uncertainty created paralysis. Commanders who responded aggressively to every report exhausted their forces through constant marching and found their credibility eroded when threats proved illusory. Those who became cautious and waited for confirmation often reacted too slowly, allowing Vikings to strike and withdraw before defenders could respond effectively. The Vikings' mobility amplified the effectiveness of these deceptive strategies. Unlike land-based armies that left obvious trails and required days to reposition, Viking fleets could move with astonishing speed and leave minimal evidence of their intentions. A fleet observed sailing north might, under cover of darkness or fog, reverse course and strike south. Ships that appeared to be departing the region might simply sail beyond the horizon, wait for nightfall, and return to attack the same coast from a different angle. This fluidity made Viking intentions impossible to predict with confidence. Documentary evidence reveals that Vikings sometimes employed what modern military theorists would recognize as information warfare. They deliberately spread false information about their numbers, intentions, and locations. Captured prisoners might be released with fabricated stories about where the Vikings planned to strike next. Local collaborators, and the Vikings cultivated these relationships wherever possible, would spread rumors designed to create confusion and misdirect defensive responses. In some instances, Vikings appear to have staged visible preparations for an assault on one location while secretly planning to attack another, ensuring that observers would carry misleading intelligence to defenders. The river systems of Europe provided Vikings with extraordinary opportunities for strategic deception. Defenders naturally focused their attention on coastal approaches, but Viking longships could penetrate deep inland via navigable rivers. The Seine, Loire, Thames, Shannon, and numerous other waterways became highways for Viking penetration into the heart of supposedly secure territories. Fortifications designed to protect against seaborne assault were positioned at river mouths or along coasts, leaving interior regions vulnerable. Vikings exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly. They would sail upriver, sometimes covering dozens or even hundreds of miles from the coast, to strike at targets that had never conceived of, themselves as vulnerable to seaborne raiders. The psychological impact was profound. Communities that had considered themselves safely inland suddenly found Viking longships beached on their riverbanks. The raid on Paris in 845, when Ragnar Lothbrok's fleet sailed up the Seine and besieged the city, demonstrated that even the capital of a major kingdom was not beyond Viking reach. The Vikings' river tactics included sophisticated deceptions specific to inland waterway navigation. They would sometimes portage their ships around defended bridges or riverine fortifications, reappearing upstream of defensive positions that commanders had assumed would block further penetration. They constructed temporary fortified camps on river islands or at strategic points, creating forward bases that extended their operational range and provided secure positions from which to conduct multiple raids. These camps were often positioned at river junctions, allowing Vikings to threaten multiple routes simultaneously and keep defenders guessing about their next target. Perhaps the most devastating form of Viking deception involved their use of overwintering. Early in the Viking Age, raiders followed a predictable pattern: arrive in spring or summer, conduct raids, and depart before autumn. Storms made sea travel dangerous. Defenders adapted to this rhythm, maintaining high alert during the raiding season and relaxing their guard during winter months. Vikings shattered this comfortable pattern by establishing fortified winter camps in the territories they raided. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 pioneered this approach, but it was adopted widely across Viking operational theaters. By remaining through the winter, Vikings achieved multiple deceptive advantages. First, they could launch raids during months when defenders assumed they were safe. Second, they could strike early in the spring before coastal defenses had been fully reactivated. Third, and most significantly, overwintering allowed Vikings to conduct sustained campaigns rather than hit-and-run raids, fundamentally changing the nature of the threat. Defenders found themselves facing an entirely new strategic situation. The traditional pattern had been to endure the raiding season, then use the winter months to recover, rebuild, and prepare for the next year. With Vikings present year-round, this recovery period vanished. Communities remained under threat continuously, and the psychological strain proved immense. Defenders could never relax, never fully rebuild, never complete preparations. The Vikings had transformed episodic raids into a state of perpetual warfare. The Vikings' approach to siege warfare incorporated significant elements of deception. When confronting fortified positions they could not immediately overcome, Vikings demonstrated remarkable patience and creativity. They would sometimes appear to abandon a siege, withdrawing ostentatiously and allowing defenders to believe they had been driven off. Once the defenders relaxed their guard or emerged from their fortifications, Vikings would return suddenly and overwhelm them. This tactic appears repeatedly in contemporary accounts, suggesting it was a deliberate strategy rather than coincidence. In other instances, Vikings would conduct what modern military theory terms reconnaissance by fire, probing attacks designed to test defenses and identify weaknesses rather than achieve immediate conquest. These probes might appear to be failed assaults, causing defenders to become overconfident and careless. When Vikings returned with a real assault, often approaching from an unexpected direction or exploiting a weakness identified during the probing attack, defenders were caught unprepared. The Vikings' treatment of captured territories revealed another dimension of their deceptive strategy. Rather than simply plundering and departing, Vikings often extracted tribute, danegeld, in exchange for peace. This practice, which became widespread in England and Francia, created a perverse incentive structure. Kingdoms would pay enormous sums to make Vikings leave, but these payments funded future expeditions and attracted more raiders. Moreover, Vikings frequently violated these agreements, returning to attack regions that had already paid for peace. Defenders could never be certain whether paying danegeld would actually provide security or simply delay the inevitable while draining their resources. Some historians argue that Vikings deliberately cultivated this uncertainty, sometimes honoring agreements and sometimes breaking them according to a calculated strategy designed to maximize long-term extraction of wealth. Kingdoms that paid danegeld were marked as sources of easy money, attracting additional Viking attention. Those that resisted might be attacked more severely initially, but could potentially deter future raids. This created a strategic dilemma for medieval rulers. Which approach actually provided better security? The Vikings had structured the situation so that no choice was clearly optimal. The archaeological record reveals that Vikings employed physical camouflage and deception in ways that contemporary written sources rarely mention. Ship burials and ship finds show that Vikings sometimes painted their sails in patterns that might blend with sea and sky, making their vessels harder to spot at distance. Some ships appear to have been deliberately constructed in colors and finishes that reduced their visibility. While evidence for this is fragmentary, it suggests Vikings thought carefully about reducing their detectability even before they approached hostile coasts. The cumulative effect of Viking deceptive tactics was not merely tactical success in individual raids, but the systematic breakdown of the entire framework of coastal defense that had been developed over centuries. This collapse occurred at multiple levels: military, economic, political, and psychological, creating cascading failures that left kingdoms vulnerable even when they possessed theoretically adequate resources to mount effective resistance. The economic dimension of this collapse proved particularly devastating. Medieval coastal defense systems required sustained investment. Watchtowers needed to be manned continuously, garrisons required regular payment, fortifications demanded maintenance, and signal systems had to be kept operational. These costs were substantial, but kingdoms bore them willingly when they believed the defenses provided genuine security. Viking deceptive tactics undermined this cost-benefit calculation by demonstrating repeatedly that these expensive systems could be circumvented or rendered ineffective. As raids continued despite heavy defensive investments, the political will to maintain these systems eroded. Local populations questioned why they should pay taxes to support defenses that failed to protect them. Regional lords disputed who should bear the financial burden, particularly when Vikings seemed able to strike anywhere regardless of defensive preparations. The coordination required to maintain effective coastal defense fractured as different regions pursued contradictory strategies, some favoring increased fortification, others preferring mobile forces, still others advocating for paying Danegeld to buy peace. This fragmentation of defensive strategy played directly into Viking hands. A coordinated defense might have concentrated resources efficiently and presented a unified front, but the Vikings' deceptive tactics made coordination nearly impossible. By the time messengers carried word of an attack from one region to another, Vikings had often already struck and departed. The speed and unpredictability of their movements meant that mutual support between regions rarely arrived in time to affect outcomes. Kingdoms found themselves fighting dozens of separate engagements rather than mobilizing their full strength against a single identifiable threat. The psychological impact on defenders cannot be overstated. Chronic uncertainty about when and where Vikings might strike created a state of perpetual anxiety in coastal regions. Communities lived under constant threat, never knowing if tomorrow would bring devastation. This psychological warfare had profound social effects. Productive economic activity declined as people hesitated to invest in enterprises that might be destroyed in the next raid. Coastal settlements were abandoned as populations moved inland seeking safety. The most skilled craftsmen and wealthiest merchants, those with the most to lose, relocated away from vulnerable areas, draining coastal regions of their economic vitality. Contemporary chronicles document the social breakdown that accompanied prolonged Viking pressure. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Frankish Annals, and Irish records all describe communities torn apart by disagreement over how to respond to the Viking threat. Some advocated resistance at any cost, others favored accommodation and tribute payment. Still others proposed abandoning exposed positions entirely. These internal divisions were themselves a form of Viking success. The raiders had created situations where communities damaged themselves through internal conflict, even without direct Viking action. The Vikings' deceptive tactics also exploited and exacerbated existing political divisions within the kingdoms they targeted. Succession disputes, regional rivalries, and conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical authorities all provided opportunities for Viking manipulation. There is substantial evidence that Vikings sometimes allied with one faction in a civil conflict, providing military support in exchange for payment, territory, or simply the opportunity to raid their erstwhile allies' enemies with impunity. These interventions in local politics gave Vikings detailed knowledge of regional weaknesses while further fragmenting any coordinated defensive response. The case of England during the 9th century illustrates this dynamic clearly. The various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, had long histories of rivalry and intermittent warfare. Vikings exploited these divisions masterfully, sometimes allying with one kingdom against another, sometimes playing kingdoms off against each other to prevent unified resistance. When the great heathen army arrived in 865, it was able to conquer East Anglia, Northumbria, and much of Mercia, in part because these kingdoms failed to support each other effectively. The political fragmentation that had characterized Anglo-Saxon England for centuries became a fatal weakness when confronted with an enemy who systematically exploited it. Even when defenders managed to achieve temporary success against Viking forces, the raiders' deceptive strategies often turned apparent victories into Pyrrhic ones. Vikings would sometimes deliberately accept tactical defeats to achieve strategic objectives. A raiding party might allow itself to be cornered and defeated, but only after sending away most of the plunder and the majority of their forces. Defenders would celebrate their victory and relax their vigilance, allowing other Viking groups to operate more freely. Alternatively, Vikings might agree to tribute payments and withdraw after suffering a defeat, creating the impression that military resistance was effective, only to return the following year in greater strength, having used the tribute to fund a larger expedition. The adaptive capacity of Viking tactics frustrated defensive planning. When kingdoms developed countermeasures to specific Viking techniques, the raiders modified their approaches. English attempts to block river access by fortifying bridges and constructing boom chains across waterways initially showed promise, but Vikings responded by portaging around obstacles or conducting more of their raids via overland routes after landing at undefended points. Frankish efforts to establish fortified centers of resistance inspired Vikings to bypass these strong points and strike at softer targets, or to settle in for extended sieges, knowing that the defenders' supplies were limited while Vikings could forage from the surrounding countryside. This adaptive capacity was itself a form of deception. It created perpetual uncertainty about which defensive measures would actually prove effective. Commanders investing resources in specific countermeasures could never be confident that these investments would pay off, as Vikings might simply change their tactics to render the countermeasures obsolete. This dynamic trapped defenders in a strategic dilemma. Should they continue developing defenses against current Viking tactics, knowing these would likely be circumvented, or attempt to anticipate future Viking adaptations, risking investing in preparations for threats that might never materialize? The archaeological record reveals the material consequences of defensive system collapse. Across regions subjected to sustained Viking pressure, there is clear evidence of economic decline, settlement abandonment, and reduced investment in infrastructure. Coin hoards become more common, evidence that people were burying their wealth for safekeeping rather than using it productively. The quality and quantity of metalwork declines. Church construction virtually ceases in heavily raided regions. These material indicators confirm what written sources suggest. Viking deceptive tactics created an environment where normal economic and social activity became untenable. Interestingly, the collapse of traditional coastal defenses sometimes prompted innovation. Alfred the Great's response to the Viking threat in Wessex included not only military reforms, but also systematic efforts to counter Viking deceptive advantages. He established a network of fortified towns, burhs, positioned so that no location in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a defensive position. This network reduced Vikings' ability to exploit undefended areas, as rapid concentration of forces became possible. Alfred also developed a naval force specifically designed to intercept Viking fleets, attempting to engage raiders at sea before they could employ their land-based deceptive tactics. However, even these innovations required decades to implement and remained vulnerable to Viking counter-adaptations. The Boer system was effective primarily because it was part of a comprehensive reform of military organization, taxation, and governance, changes that most kingdoms lacked the political capacity or resources to implement. Alfred's successes in Wessex highlighted how thoroughly Viking deceptive tactics had undermined traditional defensive systems by demonstrating that effective resistance required revolutionary changes to military and political organization. The religious and cultural impact of defensive collapse deserves attention. Monasteries and churches, which often held concentrations of portable wealth and were positioned in exposed coastal or riverine locations, suffered disproportionately from Viking raids. The sack of Lindisfarne in 793, while not the first Viking raid, achieved particular notoriety because it struck at a major religious center previously thought secure. The pattern repeated across Europe. Iona, Jarrow, Tours, and countless other religious sites were attacked, often repeatedly. These attacks on religious centers had effects beyond immediate material losses. They challenged the spiritual authority of the Church and raised troubling theological questions. If God permitted these pagan raiders to desecrate holy sites, what did this imply about divine favor? Some contemporary observers interpreted Viking success as divine punishment for Christian sins, while others struggled to reconcile religious faith with the apparent inability of Christian kingdoms to protect even their most sacred sites. This spiritual crisis compounded the military and political challenges, further undermining the confidence and cohesion necessary for effective resistance. The eventual adaptation to and partial containment of the Viking threat came not through perfecting traditional coastal defenses, but through fundamental transformations in military organization, political structure, and strategic thinking. The lessons learned from the failure of coastal defenses against Viking deception had profound and lasting impacts on European military development, some of which remain relevant to strategic thinking even in the modern era. The most successful responses to Viking tactics shared common features: flexibility, redundancy, and acceptance that perfect defense was impossible. Rather than attempting to prevent all Viking incursions, effective defenders focused on minimizing damage, ensuring rapid response, and creating conditions where raiding became unprofitable. This represented a fundamental shift in strategic thinking, from preventing penetration to managing the consequences of penetration and making the operational environment sufficiently hostile that raiders would seek easier targets elsewhere. Alfred the Great's defensive innovations in Wessex provide the clearest example of this adapted approach. His Boer system created multiple layers of defense rather than relying on impermeable barriers at the coastline. Vikings might land unopposed, but they would quickly encounter fortified positions that could shelter civilians and valuables while a mobile field army concentrated against them. The system accepted that Vikings would achieve tactical surprise and initial success, but structured defenses to limit their operational freedom and ensure they faced organized resistance before they could escape with significant plunder. Equally important was Alfred's restructuring of military service obligations. Traditional Anglo-Saxon military organization relied on the fyrd, a militia system where men served for limited periods before returning to their farms and occupations. This worked adequately for brief campaigns, but proved inadequate against Vikings, who might remain in the field for months or years. Alfred created a rotating system where half the fyrd remained in service, while the other half managed agricultural work, ensuring both military readiness and economic sustainability. This innovation directly addressed the Vikings' strategy of exhausting defenders through prolonged campaigns. The development of naval forces capable of intercepting Viking fleets represented another crucial adaptation. Early attempts to contest Viking sea control largely failed because defenders built ships unsuited to the tactical environment. Large, heavy vessels designed for Mediterranean-style naval combat could not match the speed and maneuverability of Viking longships. Successful naval defense required building ships that matched or exceeded Viking vessels' performance characteristics, while exploiting the defenders' advantages. Knowledge of local waters, established supply bases, and numerical superiority when properly mobilized. Alfred's investment in a fleet of ships reportedly larger and faster than Viking longships marked a turning point. While the effectiveness of this fleet remains debated by historians, contemporary sources provide limited and sometimes contradictory information. The strategic concept was sound. By threatening Vikings at sea, defenders forced raiders to account for the possibility of interception during their most vulnerable phases, approaching the coast with their intentions revealed, or departing laden with plunder and unable to maneuver freely. Even if the defending fleet won only occasional victories, the threat of interception increased the risk calculation for raiders. Beyond military adaptations, the Viking challenge prompted significant political evolution. The pressure of sustained Viking assault accelerated processes of state formation and political centralization across Europe. Small, fragmented political units proved unable to mount effective resistance, creating pressure for consolidation. In England, Viking pressure contributed to the eventual unification under Wessex's leadership. In Francia, Viking raids exposed the weakness of Carolingian authority and contributed to the emergence of regional principalities that would eventually evolve into the medieval French state. In Ireland, Viking settlement paradoxically stimulated urbanization and political development as Irish kingdoms adapted to the presence of Norse trading towns. This political evolution itself represented a response to Viking deceptive tactics. Larger, more centralized political units could maintain more sophisticated intelligence networks, coordinate defensive efforts across broader territories, and sustain the economic burden of continuous military readiness. They could also engage in strategic deception of their own, using diplomacy and misinformation to divide Viking forces or redirect them toward rival kingdoms. The political landscape that emerged from the Viking Age was fundamentally different from what preceded it, shaped in crucial ways by the need to counter Viking deceptive advantages. The eventual transition from Viking raiding to Viking settlement and integration marked another crucial development. As the 10th and 11th centuries progressed, many Viking groups shifted from pure raiding toward establishing permanent settlements in conquered territories. The Danelaw in England, the Norse kingdoms of Ireland, the Duchy of Normandy in Francia, all represented Viking populations becoming part of the political landscape rather than external threats. This transition occurred partly because continued raiding became less profitable as defenses improved, and partly because Vikings recognized opportunities in trade and agriculture that settlement offered. This integration had paradoxical effects on military development. Former Vikings brought their tactical expertise into the service of the kingdoms where they settled, enhancing defensive capabilities while also spreading knowledge of Viking techniques. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, led by descendants of Vikings who had settled in Francia, demonstrated how thoroughly Viking military culture had been absorbed into European warfare. William the Conqueror's successful invasion employed sophisticated deceptions and amphibious operations that would have been familiar to his Viking ancestors, but now directed in support of state-building rather than raiding. The longer-term legacy of Viking deceptive tactics extended beyond immediate military adaptations. The experience of facing an enemy who systematically exploited weaknesses in defensive thinking contributed to more sophisticated approaches to strategic planning. Medieval military theorists began thinking more carefully about deception, surprise, intelligence, and the exploitation of enemy assumptions. While systematic military theory would not fully develop until later centuries, the intellectual foundations were influenced by lessons learned during the Viking Age. The economic consequences of the Viking Age, driven largely by the failure of coastal defenses, proved surprisingly complex. While raiding caused enormous destruction in the short term, the disruption of established patterns stimulated innovation and adaptation. The need to protect wealth encouraged developments in banking and credit systems that reduced reliance on stored precious metals. Trade networks evolved to become more resilient, with diversified routes and partnerships that could survive local disruptions. Urban development accelerated as fortified towns offered security that dispersed rural settlements could not provide. Some regions actually experienced economic growth during and after the Viking Age, despite, or perhaps partly because of, the disruptions. The Vikings themselves became major trading partners once they established permanent settlements, connecting northern European trade networks to Scandinavian, Baltic, and through intermediaries, Byzantine and Islamic trading systems. The silver that Vikings extracted from Western Europe through raiding and tribute payments flowed through these networks, stimulating commercial activity even as it represented transferred wealth. The cultural and technological exchanges that accompanied Viking expansion had lasting impacts. Shipbuilding techniques spread and evolved as different traditions encountered each other. The Viking longship's design principles influenced vessel construction across northern Europe, while Scandinavian shipwrights adopted elements from the traditions of regions where they settled. Similar exchanges occurred in weapons manufacture, fortification design, and tactical doctrine. The Vikings' deceptive tactics themselves became part of the common military repertoire, employed by various European powers long after the Viking Age proper had ended. Modern military strategists studying the Viking Age have drawn parallels between Viking deceptive tactics and contemporary strategic challenges. The fundamental problem faced by medieval coastal defenders, how to protect extended vulnerable areas against an agile adversary who can concentrate force at any point while avoiding defended positions, remains relevant. Modern concepts like asymmetric warfare, strategic mobility, and the exploitation of seams in defensive systems all have historical antecedents in Viking tactics. The Vikings' success in rendering coastal defenses useless through deception offers broader lessons about the nature of military innovation and adaptation. Static defenses, regardless of their apparent strength, create predictable patterns that adaptive adversaries can exploit. Overinvestment in specific defensive systems risks creating brittleness. When those systems fail, as Viking deceptions ensured they would, defenders lack alternative approaches. Successful defense requires flexibility, redundancy, and acceptance of uncertainty rather than pursuit of absolute security through fixed fortifications. Perhaps the most profound lesson concerns the psychological and cognitive dimensions of warfare. The Vikings succeeded not simply through superior ships or fierce warriors, but through their systematic exploitation of how defenders thought about security. They identified assumptions embedded in defensive planning about how naval warfare operated, where attacks would occur, when raiding season happened, and violated these assumptions repeatedly. This forced defenders into a state of chronic uncertainty that proved as damaging as any physical assault. The collapse of medieval coastal defenses against Viking deception ultimately stemmed from a mismatch between defensive thinking and operational reality. Defenders assumed they faced an enemy who would operate according to familiar patterns, permitting defense through established methods. Vikings recognized these assumptions as vulnerabilities and built their entire operational approach around exploiting them. By the time defenders recognized the inadequacy of their strategies, they had lost the initiative and faced the difficult task of adapting while under continuous pressure. The eventual containment of the Viking threat required nothing less than a comprehensive reimagining of defense. New political structures, new military organizations, new strategic concepts, and new technologies. The process took generations and fundamentally transformed European civilization. The medieval world that emerged from the Viking Age bore little resemblance to the early medieval world that had initially seemed so vulnerable to Norse raiders. In this sense, Viking deception succeeded beyond even its immediate tactical and strategic impacts. It served as a catalyst for profound historical change, forcing adaptations that shaped European development for centuries to come.